2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, since the year began 3 months ago, the US has gone into two wars. Essentially, a war against Venezuela when they literally took out their leader and literally used a Black Hawk helicopter to literally bring them to New York. And recently, obviously, Iran. These things are very interventionist, and in as much as Donald Trump and the entire geopolitical situation sucks, I would rather deal with the reciprocal tariff economic warfare drama we were doing with all of these states as opposed to literally going into war with them. But side opposition might say, oh, bro, it's a chicken and the egg problem. We don't know necessarily what comes first. Economic things could lead to direct war. But I think that absent the rather isolated nature of how Donald Trump is likely to react, ultimately speaking, economic warfare is quite effective and ultimately a better tool in terms of doing this. On both sides of the house, warfare is going to happen. People are going to suffer. But what I'm going to tell you, and the path to victory coming from our side, is that the supported use of economic warfare prevents direct conflict. And under comparative, absent economic warfare, direct conflict is likely to be more escalatory and ultimately bloodier. This is because we need to understand the context. Amidst a globalized and interconnected world that we're seeing, we're also seeing a changing world order. US hegemonic power is strong, it was strong, but it's quite different now with the rise of China, India, Russia, Europe, and the EU, the Middle East with OPEC, and ultimately, these particular people are increasing the competition given a multipolar world. This implies an increased selfish desire to gain power and influence, but because resources are scarce, it creates a conflict of interest. That is to say, you have countries like China and Russia doing predatory lending and literally going into war like what we saw with Russia, ultimately as a means to be able to solve a lot of the resource problems. They need to be put in check. Or sketchy countries like Kim Jong in North Korea being protectionist and recluse, potentially building some sort of nuclear program we're all sketched out by. I have a few things to say. The first thing I want to be able to say is that primarily because of things like greed and wanting to have a competitive advantage, nations, especially those who are trigger happy or those hiding behind certain curtains, are more likely to go into war, and we need the supported use of economic warfare to be able to put a check against that. I have a few strategic observations. The first strategic observation is that opening government literally spends like 14 minutes explaining the motion and the framing, and I do appreciate that. But as what opening opposition mentioned, it's quite unclear why economic warfare is the tipping point and why this is better. I have a few responses to solve this concern. Number one, it's literally better as an alternative compared to direct war. Direct war, like literally assassinating leaders, invading, bombing, and even planting puppet governments to forward proxies. Absent this, countries are more likely to go into military forms of intervention, like precision strikes, etc., in order to be able to get these resources. That is to say, economic warfare is prior than direct conflict, and ultimately, and in many different cases, a sufficient way to be able to deal with these things. Yes, on both sides of the house, there will be direct warfare, but the simple push is that direct warfare is less likely to happen at the point in which we're able to get the results with economic warfare. I'll take you in a while. The second part to this is explaining that it creates an economic mutually assured destruction as opposed to traditional mutually assured destruction during the time post-World War II with the advent of things like nuclear weapons, bioweapons, and now AI-fueled drones that literally allow unmanned combat to necessarily be able to happen, perpetuating certain conflicts. Why does this necessarily mean less conflict when you have economic warfare? Because both sides stand more to lose, and ultimately, they would rather use these forms of soft power in their political sphere as opposed to sending boots on the ground, which literally put a lot of people in harm's way. The third thing I'm going to talk about here is that opening government doesn't necessarily explain what support looks like or not, and I think that coming from closing government, we're going to mechanize and explain what this support looks like. Quite simply, this looks like in hard ways of support, like literally propping up certain leaders and supporting direct officials who are more likely to be able to do this, like the chair of the central bank and even certain people in the upper or lower house, and also doing this in soft ways, meaning not necessarily having all these smear canceling campaigns on social media and within the algo of the digital space, but directly supporting this as a better alternative to direct conflict. Before that, POI, whoever raised it earlier. Not necessarily, right? Because there are many instances like with China, right? Do we literally see the US and China going into direct forms of conflict? No. Could that change in the future? Maybe. But I'd literally rather have this whole mommy and daddy fighting and them doing these economic warfare as opposed to like disproportionate asymmetrical warfare that I characterized in my peroration. Let's deal with opening opposition, right? I think opening opposition literally has no alternative. Like, I'm not entirely sure how they solve the things they're accusing us of. At best, it's a negative case. I think things like reciprocal tariff, things like embargoes on oil and other commodities are bad, but direct conflict in many instances literally leads to more money spent and more lives necessarily lost. What have I told you coming from our extension? Using economic warfare is likely to be able to lead to less direct forms of conflict, and under comparative, it's ultimately worse. We think this is ultimately an effective means to be able to hold these countries and these rulers liable, to be able to comply with the rules of global engagement. Being a team player, necessarily understanding the interconnected nature of different asset classes all around the world, and ultimately not necessarily retaliating and being trigger happy just because you can do it. Contrary to popular belief, things can get worse, and that's likely to happen on side negative as opposed to on side proposition. Thank you.